Hello everyone, and welcome to the second part of this Twilight of the Sun King tutorial series. In the last episode, we covered basic mechanics of the rule set regarding movement and action tests. In this episode, we'll be looking at morale tests on both unit and army level, as well as their outcomes. Let's dive right into it. Last time, a unit of Swedish cavalry charged one of the Russian dragoons that had just formed into a line formation opposite to them. As the next Russian turn begins, before his movement phase, he must take a morale test with his units that are in some sort of immediate danger. Reasons for taking a morale test include things such as being charged by an enemy unit, being fired upon by an enemy unit, being under concentrated artillery fire from multiple artillery units. To take a morale test, the Russian player rolls 2 dice, scoring an 8. To pass a morale test without any adverse effects, you need to have a total of an 8 or higher. A score of 4 to a 7 is a morale failure, resulting in the unit losing one of its morale heads. A score of 3 or less causes the unit to rout immediately. The score of the 2 dice is further modified by a series of modifiers. Now, while there are quite a few of these, I've found they become easier to remember once I started to consider them in 2 different groups: modifiers from unit qualities and circumstantial modifiers. Let's look at the Russian Dragoon unit to determine some of the unit qualities first. All units in Twilight of the Sun King are rated with 3 different qualities: their size, their morale, and their drill. Our Dragoon is standard sized, has regular morale, and is a trained unit. As such, it has no unit qualities that would affect the dice roll or the outcome. What about circumstantial modifiers? These include modifiers that have to do with the circumstances of the specific combat or morale test situation, rather than the unit itself. In our case, the Dragoon unit has been charged this turn, giving it a -1 modifier to its roll. They also get another -1 modifier for being a cavalry unit in combat with a galloping horse unit, which are specialized in countering enemy cavalry formations. Finally, they gain another -1 for being dragoons in contact with non-dragoon regular cavalry. In total, the dragoons get a 0 modifier from their unit qualities and a -3 from circumstantial modifiers. With the roll of an 8, the modified score is 5. As they've now failed their morale test, they lose one of their 2 morale heads. On top of this, because they are cavalry that have lost in a melee combat, they must now break off. This means that they are moved their full movement backwards, regardless of terrain or friendly units, as they retreat from the combat to regroup. If the other Dragoon unit behind them had been in line, rather than in column, it could have supported the unit in front, but we'll come back to that a little later. Now, let's move a little further on in our battle. As the 2 sides are trying to cross the river, a battle takes place between Bauer's dragoons that have charged the Swedish reserve cavalry. Looking at the unit qualities of our Swedish cavalry, consisting of squadrons from Åbos, Nylands and Karelska regiments, we find that they have a high morale rating, giving them an extra morale hit, but no modifiers to the roll itself. The circumstances of the combat give us more modifiers though. -1 for being charged, and +1 for defending a linear obstacle, that is to say the river. You'll note that the Swedish horse does not get bonuses for those things that the enemy got negative modifiers for. The units failing morale tests are unlikely to be broiled in heavy combat. It's more likely that they've simply turned tail and fled at the sight of the charging formation. The Swedes roll a 10 on their test, and with the modifiers totaling to 0, they pass their morale test. This means that they have withstood the enemy approach and the two units are now locked in combat. The Dragoons will have to test for their own morale after the Swedish movement phase. Let's look at some more morale test situations. Here we see a Russian infantry unit that has advanced to fire upon a Swedish cavalry unit. While unit qualities once again provide no modifiers, cavalry always get a -1 modifier for being fired upon by infantry units. Rolling their morale test, they get a 4. With the modifiers, this becomes a 3, which would rout the otherwise fresh formation. This is where commanders have another purpose in the game. If a unit close by to them rolls an unsatisfactory result, they can join that unit to try and rally them personally. This grants the units a reroll. Regardless of the commander's skill level, they can only join one combat per morale phase. Levenhaupt joins the unit, rerolls the morale test, scoring a total of 6 modified to a 5. This is still a failure that causes a morale hit, but now the unit stays on the field, albeit slightly shaken by the hail of enemy musket fire. Here we have a morale test taken by the Russian infantry as Swedish troops are closing in towards them. They've rolled a 7. The Russian unit is small, meaning they get a -1 to their morale test, but they get a +1 for having larger amounts of muskets in their formation compared to the enemy, and a +1 for having a unit in rear support. These total to an 8, making the test a success. Now let's see how cavalry are affected by support. A charge by Swedish cavalry causes a morale failure in a Russian Dragoon unit, which is forced to break off from the melee. Instead of fleeing their full movement backwards, they can fall back behind their supporting units, who are in line formation and with their frontage aligned to the same direction as them. I hope these examples have given you some idea about how morale tests are calculated and how they work. The main thing to remember is the order of operations in a turn. As your turn begins, you first take morale tests, then move your units, and finally assign artillery fire. This order of operations is slightly skewed because the defender always begins the game with their artillery fire. This shouldn't be a problem for a bright player such as yourself. Now let's look at the final issue at hand, army and command morale tests. In our example game, the Swedes had a single command with 7 units in it. With 4 of them having been routed, Levenhaupt now has to take a special command morale test during each morale phase to see if his army will stay on the field. He rolls a d6, adding his command skill of 2 to the roll, needing a total of 4 or more. He rolls a 6 and his army stays on the field. A short while later, General Bauer's command comes under a heavy attack and loses 3 of its 5 units. As his command has lost more than half of its units, he now has to take a command morale test. He rolls a d6, adding his skill of 1, but gets a 2. With this, Bauer's command abandons the field, and he and all his troops are removed from the table. With all of Bauer's command gone, half of the Russians' 2 commands have now been broken, and Sheremetev, the commander-in-chief, needs to take an army morale test. This is done in the same way as a command morale test, but only succeeds on a total of 5 or more. Sheremetev rolls a 3, which with his skill of 1 is not enough to keep the Russian army on the table. This means that the Swedes are victorious, albeit with the skin of their teeth. In these examples, these rolls may have seemed unfair to the Russian side, but that is partly due to the small size of this example scenario. In an average game, you should aim to have at least one side have 3 or more commands, representing the center and the 2 wings of the army. Or if playing in a large multiplayer game, perhaps even having multiple commands under each wing commander in each of those 3 sections of the full army. I hope this video has helped you to understand some of the mechanics behind morale tests in Twilight of the Sun King. Many of the more advanced mechanics relating to morale tests are covered in the rulebook, but understanding these basic mechanics will help you along in your first few games. If you have any further questions, please feel free to ask them in the comments below. In the last part of this tutorial series, we'll look at how to organize an army in Twilight of the Sun King, and how to turn a historical battle into a wargame scenario. I hope to see you in the third part of this tutorial series.